Alright class, welcome to the week 1 lecture. This is going to be introductions, examples, and definitions of abnormal behavior. So just like our intro lecture, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be watching the video from last fall. So that's fall 2020. And if I see anything that I want to change or see any edits or any additions, I'm going to pop on the video and then I'm going to say something. So you're going to be watching me, watch myself, give a lecture. So we'll be watching this together. So this is going to be a little bit longer than the lecture itself. But if you go to week 1, there's a folder there with all the old lectures if you just want to watch those lectures. As we progress through the semester, this might be a way for me to maybe clarify some errors, some mistakes, maybe talk a little bit about some of the quiz content, and also just have a greater discussion of the material outside of the lecture. So some of these lectures are brief, maybe an hour or so, and some of them are up to 4 hours long. So this will be fun for all of us. We're all going to enjoy this. So let's go ahead and get watching. I'll go ahead and mute myself and we'll get looking at this. So just so you know, you should be having your lecture notes out. So that's going to Compass, downloading the slides. Make sure you have something to write with or type with, and just follow along. Now, as we progress through the semester, this might be more complex, and there might be some issues involved with this, so I might switch the format. But for right now, this is how we're going to do it. So let's see what happens. Let's see how this works out for all of us. All right, so without further ado, here we go.
All right, everybody. So today we're going to go ahead and get started with our week 1 lecture. This is going to be examples and definitions of psychopathology. So unit 1 is going to be what is abnormal. And so we're going to go ahead and get started about this. If you have any questions, you're going to send me an email. Make sure that you have your syllabus with you so you understand how everything works. Make sure.
I just want to pause real quick. Look at that camera quality. Look at that camera quality. Like, I was rocking with this. This is what I was... Like, people were trying to figure out what was happening. It's horrible quality. That's terrible. Oh man, that's wild. Sorry, this has nothing to do with the lecture. It's not going to be on the quiz. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. That's ridiculous. Like, I didn't even realize just how bad that looked. All right, let's keep going.
Make sure that you're taking notes. Keep in mind that you're going to have those participation point quizzes. So, keep a lookout for that. Also, want you to go ahead and make sure that you have those slides downloaded from Compass. If you have any problems, send me an email, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about defining abnormal behavior. Then we're going to talk about the DSM-5 definition of a mental disorder. We're going to talk about the role of culture in psychopathology. And then we're going to talk about epidemiology. But first, let's go ahead and let's quiz ourselves. So go ahead and read through the questions, pause the video, and just answer, what do you think? What do you think? What is psychopathology? Is it the study of mentally ill people or mentally stressed people, or the manifestation of bad behaviors from naughty people, which may be indicative of a need to be locked up in jail? Is it B, the study of mental illness or mental distress, or the manifestation of behaviors and experiences which may be indicative of mental illness or psychological impairment? Is it the study of brain defects or brain disease, or the manifestation of behaviors and experiences which may be indicative of brain trauma or neurological impairment? Is it the study of mental illness or mental distress, or the manifestation of behaviors and experiences which may be indicative of neurological defects or neurological impairment? Or is it E, none of the above? So go ahead and press pause on your video. Just wait for a couple of seconds, and then go ahead and choose your answer. All right. So you've paused, you're unpaused. Let's go ahead and see what you chose. Okay, the right answer was B. So if you chose B, that's good. If not, think about it and send me an email if you have questions of why, your option was wrong. So this is the definition we're going to...
All right, just real quick. So that's pretty much how we do the iClicker questions. So rather than you sitting in class with your little remote, it's going to be you watching me in the video. I'll pause it a little bit, and then I'll go over the questions, give you like the answer choices, And this is just for you to gauge your own comprehension of the material. I would encourage you to take this seriously. Some people don't, and then it shows up later. So please take this seriously. Also, quick note, if you want to get all the participation points you can, literally log on to Compass, watch these videos, and then follow along. When you see the question pop up, answer the question. You get 5 out of 5 on every participation points. It boggles my mind how people don't get 5 out of 5s. All the answers are in the videos. Just watch the video and do the quiz. You get 5 out of 5. You never have to worry about it. All right. And then once you get to 40 points, right, you can stop taking them. Once you earn 40 points total, you never have to take another participation point quiz. So you can be done in like the first 8 weeks. It's like the half of the semester you can be just like chilling doing other things rather than doing participation points. I would, of course, encourage you to continue to do participation points because it's like a way of quizzing yourself on course content. But you know what I'm saying. Like, you got stuff to do. All right, let's keep going.
To be working from. So psychopathology is a manifestation of and the study of the causes of mental disorders. And this has actually been used interchangeably with the term abnormal psychology. Now, when we see abnormal psychology, problems in living, and psychopathology and mental illness, these have all been used interchangeably. And for the most part, they really are kind of interchangeable. But there are some important distinctions between them that we're going to explore today. But first, before all of that, let's go ahead and watch a quick video.
I was about 16 when I was diagnosed with depression. My doctors think that it stemmed from my parents divorcing and struggling with school, really.
It all started when my father died when I was at high school.
It all started in university during my final year.
It all started when I was 16. I came out of a relationship I was in at the time and I started purging and self-harming.
I first realised I had a mental health problem when I was 15. I was cutting myself every day and crying all the time.
Soon after the attack.
I'm going to pause this real quick. So while you're watching this video, don't just like zone out or whatever. Like, listen to what people are talking about. Listen to the narratives about mental health. So remember in the last intro video, I was talking about how, just because you have depression doesn't mean that you know everything about depression, right? But that doesn't negate your lived experience with depression. So here are some individuals who have lived experience, right? So their lived experience is not all encompassing, but it gives you an idea of what it's like for them. Okay, and so also you might notice that with some of these individuals, you might hear some things that could be distressing to you or remind you about or remind you of like some of your relatives or some of the things that you struggle with, or maybe a friend or a loved one, something like that. It's important to understand that we all experience different levels of distress around, across like different, constructs, different dimensions. So like we all experience sadness, we all experience anxiety, we all experience fear and things like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those experiences are pathological. So these individuals right here are talking about their experiences, their lived experiences with a psychological disorder. So let's go ahead and listen to that. Listen, just like try to pick up on some symptoms, pick up on some ideas. Later in the semester, when we start talking about things like depression and anxiety, maybe come back and watch this video and kind of look at the things that you picked up on and gauge yourself and gauge your clinical sense, right? Okay, let's go ahead and get going.
Attack happened, I started to feel throes of anxiety, panic attacks started creeping in.
I first realised that I had a problem when I really wanted to stop all the things I was doing, but I just couldn't seem to stop no matter how badly I wanted to.
I was suffering from hallucinations, which at the time were really scary because I didn't know what was reality and what was my imagination.
At my worst, I felt like I was absolutely worthless, alienating and destructive, with no help of recovery.
I felt like I had this black cloud hanging constantly over my head, and it's just a feeling that stays with you and you can't seem to get away from it at all, and you feel completely alone.
I felt like this was going to be it forever.
I felt as though I'd never reach any of my ambitions or my goals.
I felt like I was in my own bubble, hearing muffled voices of people around me.
When I had my first proper mental breakdown, and I decided to run away from home.
I felt like the world would be better off without me.
My mental health problem means that I go through many highs and lows which I struggle to control.
Sometimes I just want to hide away.
I feel that I have to make everyone else happy and every day is a struggle, but I just remind myself that I'm strong.
My mental health problem means that sometimes the world can be a very scary, very dangerous and very dark place.
Everyday tasks can become the most mammoth missions that seem like you're never going to be able to do them.
My mental health problem means that life is hard.
The hardest thing about having a mental health problem is people not realising that there's something wrong with you and that you can be really ill even if you look absolutely fine. I think especially having an eating disorder, people assume that you're going to look a certain way or be a certain size or a shape, or they imagine certain stereotypes that aren't necessarily true.
Like the social, and in my case like the cultural stigma associated with it.
If I'm having a bad day, no matter how small it is, it feels like the whole world's crashing in on me and things just keep getting worse.
Just trying to get the people around me to understand what I'm going through when they haven't gone through something like me is probably the hardest thing.
Social situations in particular can be really difficult. I sometimes can't commit to what we'd call sort of normal everyday activities.
The word schizo, I think it has a lot of stigma attached to it. I really don't like it.
What really reassured me was knowing that there are so many other people out there who've got the same diagnosis as me and that I'm not alone.
Having my 2 rescue dogs to look after and to take care of, because I know that they need me around and they're always happy to see me, so no matter how bad my day is or how awful everything seems to be, I know that they need me and they always make me smile.
Having such a great network of friends, family and people who are out there who can help.
I'd look at how far I've come and everything that I'd gone through and realise that I am still standing.
It really helps when my friends treat me the way that they did 6 years ago before this all started. I was that happy, laid-back person, and that's the person that I want to be and aspire to be again.
It really helps me when people just treat me normally.
I'd like people to treat me like you would your own mother, I guess. I think that's a good way to treat people.
I don't want people to tiptoe around me.
I'd like people to treat me like any other normal person, but also just to be a bit more sensitive around me, not to be stigmatised, depression and everything, and telling me to cheer up and everything.
I wish I'd known how much I was going to grow and learn as I grew up and grew older. I wish I'd known how much therapy was going to help me and how much I was going to gain from that. And I wish I'd known that it was possible to meet people who would love me for all of me, including my mental illness.
That I didn't have to feel so alone and that there was a lot of support out there.
That there are people out there and organisations that can help me.
I don't regret having mental health problems because it has made me who I am today.
I wish I'd known just how supportive people can be once you tell them what you're going through.
People are accepting. They're not going to walk down the street and cry, "You mental case." They're not going to, they're not going to do anything like that. Everyone's incredibly understanding. And if they're not, them.
So the best piece of advice I'd have to give would be just getting over that initial fear of coming out to people about your condition, because once you talk about it, it really does help.
The best piece of advice I ever got was to just focus on today, because you can't change what's happened in the past, and there's honestly no real way of predicting what's going to happen in the future.
I know it's hard, but be yourself and be brave and you will recover.
Take each day as it comes, and even if that's too much, break it right down to just 5 minutes at a time. I find that really helps.
Just ask for help, just make that step and ask anybody, and they will be supportive for you.
Everybody has scars. Some people have them in the mind and some people have them on legs like I do.
Just basically be yourself. That's simple enough and what it might be a bit cliche, but I guess it's true.
It's okay to be mental, and that most people are, just not in the same way as you, but there are ways to get help.
Even if you think that things can't get better, that you've tried so many times and you've fed up and you've had enough of trying, things really can, and you can get better and you can recover. So don't give up on yourself.
All right, so those are real people with real mental health concerns, and real people who want to be treated like real people. So what are some thoughts you might have had about that video? Like, what are some of the things you noticed? What are some of the things that really stood out to you? Just take some time and think about it. Think about how you kind of connect with that. Think about how some people that in your life might connect with that, and really understand that mental health is along the spectrum. So as we go through later in the semester, we are been talking about some very serious things. So I do want to let everybody know that if you feel like that content might be troubling to you, please take whatever self-care concerns that you have or self-care steps you might need to do to address that material. Also understand that when we get into symptoms and everything, that these symptoms exist along the spectrum. So if you kind of notice that you endorse some of these symptoms, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have whatever disorder we're studying. So understand that we all experience some of these symptoms to some degree. So just keep that in mind. All right,
that's really good stuff right there. And also want to talk a little bit about the stigma of mental health, which we'll probably get into in this lecture and some other lectures down the road. So some individuals view that the term abnormal psychology and psychopathology can be extremely problematic. And so people don't like to use those terms, they like to use other kinds of terms, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We want to let you know that when we're talking about abnormal, we're not talking about the individual. We're talking about the behavior, the mental processes, the neurochemicals, things like that, which is abnormal. So when you hear normal, like this term normal people, that can be very stigmatizing for individuals who are suffering from issues. So for example, you wouldn't want to call somebody who had cancer like you wouldn't want to try to talk about them as a person. You want to talk about the illness that they have. They're not a cancer person, they're like a person with cancer. So you want to think about something like that. So that's like person-centered versus like diagnosis-centered language. However, later on in the semester, we will kind of go against that a little bit, and how some individuals with certain diagnoses view their diagnoses as a primary part of their identity, with things like autism spectrum disorders. Also, even myself as a recovering alcoholic, sometimes my identity as an alcoholic is more important than my other identities, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. So when it comes to stigmatizing mental health, this is when we view people who have mental health issues as being problematic persons, right? Rather than persons with problems. So we all suffer from mental health concerns. We all know somebody who has mental health issues. And it's important that if you recognize for yourself some of these traits, doesn't necessarily mean that you meet criteria for diagnoses. And it's kind of kind of unfair to adopt a diagnosis that you don't have, especially when individuals have a lifelong struggle. Sometimes people might be like, oh, I have super anxiety. I have an anxiety disorder, and they don't really have an anxiety disorder. They're just experiencing an anxiety, and we all experience anxiety about certain things. Also, we'll get to more of that a little bit later, but just think about how there's a spectrum of outcomes here. You can exist anywhere along that spectrum, and then there's a point in time that becomes problematic and starts to have issues within your life, where now your anxiety is maladaptive and it's getting in the way of you living your life. So anxiety is normal. Everybody experiences anxiety, but there's a certain level of anxiety which can be problematic. And also, there's a level of anxiety which is too low that can be problematic. We may talk about that a little bit later too. So I just wanted to touch on that real quick. Just to let everybody know that we should be thinking about the stigma of mental health, throughout the course. If you ever feel like we're talking about things that you don't understand, how what we're doing isn't stigmatizing, send me an email, let me know, come to office hours, we'll talk about it. I had a student who was very distressed that all we did in this course was talk about symptoms and diagnoses and how that was stigmatizing. And I was like, no, it was a little bit different. We're trying to classify behaviors, we identify how to help individuals best. So for example, an alcoholic and someone with anxiety issues, you might want to treat those individuals differently. When I say treat, I mean what kind of recovery services, what kind of treatment What kind of counseling might you give that individual? What kind of medication might you prescribe? This is why it's important to identify and understand and categorize so you can treat somebody, you can give somebody the treatment that they need. Rather than just saying like, oh, everybody's the same, let's all ride horses, and then riding horses and rubbing essential oils on our elbows is going to make us feel better. Sure, for the moment, but what if there's like a real treatment that could actually help you out? All right. And if you're into horses and essential oils, don't cancel me on Twitter. I'm just thinking out loud. All right.
So let's talk about historical ways that we have defined psychopathology. So one of these was from the ancient Greeks, and it was the four humors. So you had, blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. These were all fluids that you had inside of you, and then, at different levels, like too much or too little, could have caused some kind of, mental disorder. So, for example, the Greeks believed that black bile would cause depression. Some early religions, like early Christianity, believed in demonic possession. So there was a passage talking about, hey, I am legion, we are many. And then nowadays we might hear a statement like that talking about dissociative disorder, but at those times, people believed that there was like a spiritual cause for, these disorders. And then also across cultures, different types of mental illnesses also had like attributions to, supernatural origins. Now, even though this doesn't really occur too much nowadays, well, in some societies, I guess it does, certain cultures feared and punished those with mental illnesses, for being like witches or being possessed by demons. And then to some extent today, we kind of still do this with the prison system being the largest, warehouse for people with mental health issues.
And I do want to touch on that for a second. Our current criminal justice system does penalize individuals who can't afford to take care of themselves, can't afford their own treatment, don't have health insurance, don't have family members who can help support them. So we all have relatives and individuals who suffer from mental health issues. And there used to be mental health hospitals for people to go to. Now, the quality of those mental health hospitals are dubious at best. There is an old Geraldo Rivera expose when he goes to this famous mental hospital and old asylums, let's just call them, where individuals, there was no power and people were naked in their own filth, and it was very disturbing. And there were warehouses like that for mentally ill individuals. And then now, if someone's having a mental health issue, rather than somebody coming and taking them to the hospital or to a doctor and giving them medication, even though maybe those hospitals aren't the best, now they're being taken to prison. And so there's actually a lot of other things involved with mental health outbreaks or mental health episodes and interactions with law enforcement that we can get into a little bit later if you're interested in hearing more about that. But, sometimes we pathologize individuals who have a mental health crisis as being dangerous individuals. And sure, they might be a danger to themselves and others, but that doesn't mean that they deserve to be locked up behind bars. There has to be some kind of way to treat people. And so this is getting a little bit into the weeds. We might talk about this a little bit later with some of the other content we might discuss when we talk about like psychopathy and substance abuse issues. But I do want to put on your radar that the current prison system, their rehabilitation system, doesn't rehabilitate people. It stores them in a locked cell, scares you that these people are going to kill you and they're super dangerous. And, and there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes with prisons and jails that people don't really understand in the general population. Just so you know. All right, we're putting that out there. Okay.
So how do we define psychopathology nowadays? So mental illness is a naturally occurring concept, and there is nothing unnatural or supernatural about mental health. So even though we often put people in the categories and the boundaries between normal and abnormal are are blurry, and it's kind of hard to distinguish. And then in our readings, we have a quote that says, "It's hard to carve nature at its joints." And then down here, of course, you see the spectrum from between normal and abnormal. It's kind of hard to figure out where one ends and the other begins. So let's think about more about why is it so hard to define psychopathology relative to other illnesses and disorders.
Let me just pause that real quick. Let me just go back to this right here. So when we're talking about carving nature at its joints, that's actually an old butcher term. If you're making a chicken, you can carve the chicken in different pieces at the joints, and then you can have a chicken drumstick, a chicken wing, chicken thighs, chicken breast, things like that. You can separate the chicken, and you can say, this is where this part of the chicken begins, and this is where this part of the chicken ends. Sorry if that was triggering, or distressing to hear. But right over here, we have a dimension between normal and abnormal. So this dimension, this is where your behaviors can exist, right? Now, what makes an individual normal? What makes an individual abnormal? Where does that start, right? Where do we put that? Do we put that like over here? Or do we put that right here? Like where are we putting the normal abnormal part, right? Where's the cutoff line? Is there a gradient? And then we'll talk about this a little bit later. But this is what's difficult about normality and abnormality when we're talking about psychopathology. At what point in time does this become problematic for the individual and others? And what point of time is just maybe the normal range of experience? And as you notice here, normalcy is not a discrete category; it's a gradient. So I want you to think about that. There's normalcy as a spectrum. Think about like the bell curve, right? So you have the extreme ends, and then you have like 85% in the middle. And even that 85% in the middle, you have some variation of behaviors. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Hard to carve nature at its joints. And then down here, of course, you see the spectrum from between normal and abnormal. It's kind of hard to figure out where one ends and the other begins. So let's think about more about why is it so hard to define psychopathology relative to other illnesses and disorders. So let's think about something, like cancer. If you have a tumor on your skin, you go to a doctor, you have this tumor, the doctor might say, oh, look, this tumor is indicative of, or this growth is indicative of something that might be, a sign of cancer or some other kind of disorder. Let me, go ahead and take a little sample of this and test it and see if you're at risk. Now, with psychopathology, it's kind of difficult to measure this because the symptoms are behavioral. They're not biological. So I can't give you like a little swab in your mouth and say, oh, you have anxiety. So it's going to be very difficult to kind of like measure or define the underlying processes of psychopathology. So for example, like let's think about...
I want to talk about that real quick. So what I mean there, we're talking about behavioral versus biological. Let's talk about substance use, right? So I see somebody on the corner of the street and they're smoking some marijuana. Like I can say, oh, that person is a junkie. They're a drug addict. They're smoking marijuana. That's what junkies do. They smoke drugs, right? But really, is using drugs? Does that make me a junkie? Does that make me a drug addict? Is it that bad to smoke marijuana? Does everybody who smokes marijuana have issues? Not really. So the behavior of smoking marijuana, if I observe you smoking marijuana, I don't necessarily know that you have a drug issue, right? So if I have cancer, it's different, right? I can look at somebody, I can see an abnormal growth, I can remove that growth, I can do like a biopsy on it, I can test that, and I can detect cancer cells. And we can sort of do that with psychology, but we need more information, right? I can't just look at you, smoking marijuana and then take some kind of psychological biopsy and realize you have a drug addiction or you have a substance use issue. I really can't do that. It really can't happen. I would need more information. I would need to know about your work, your school. I really know about your family. I really need to know about your living situation, financial situation, your history. I would need to know a whole lot more rather than if I were to get a CAT scan to detect brain lesions. That might must show brain lesions. Oh, I don't know, CAT scan, MRI. You know what I'm talking about. It's easier just to detect a brain lesion than it would be to detect some kind of dysfunction in the brain that could lead to psychopathology.
Alcohol use disorder, something that I study and something that I deal with. It's kind of hard to look into somebody and find out what pathway they took to become an alcoholic, and then replicate that over everybody. Whereas when you're thinking about something like cancer or other kinds of disease development, with enough time, with enough research, you can kind of track the biological process that occurs with that. So, unlike a medical disease, there are actually large differences in the presentation or the expression of psychopathology. So there's going to be a heterogeneity in psychological symptoms, and there's a homogeneity in biological symptoms. So pretty much what this means is, we'll talk about this a little bit later. We talk about autism. So the autism spectrum disorder, there's not two that look alike, whereas I could probably group a large amount of people with breast cancer or some other kind of a kidney failure and say look at this will present itself in a certain way. Chicken pox presents itself in a certain way, but psychopathology, not so much. So let's look at some important terms, some definitions that I want you to have and to think about. So let's talk about symptoms. So when it comes to psychopathology, symptoms are defined as the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are indicative of a disorder. Now, when we're looking at symptoms, we want to consider the duration. This is going to be how long the symptoms last. The impairment. So this is the level of harm to self or others. We want to think about context, the domains and situations in which symptoms occur. And now when we look at syndrome, the syndrome is going to be a group of co-occurring symptoms that are assumed to have a common etiology. And then when we talk about etiology, we're going to be talking about the causes or the origins of a disorder.
All right, so there's going to be a lot of terms in this course that we're going to talk about. We're going to get away from vocabulary words as we go through the semester, but just right here, you should know what etiology is. Syndrome, this is going to be good for the quiz, but we're not going to talk about syndromes too much as we move through the semester. Duration, impairment, and context, these are things that are going to show up a lot when we're talking about symptoms. So when we're talking about diagnoses later in the semester, knowing the duration of the symptoms, knowing how impairing the symptoms are, and knowing the context, the domains in which the symptoms occur, it's going to be very helpful. Just a little side note here. There are going to be 3 words that there's going to be etiology, there's going to be epidemiology, and there's going to be, there's a few other words that we're going to talk about where you should know what they mean. You're going to see them on the quiz. So epidemiology is going to be this, the study of rates, right? Then you're going to have etiology, which is going to be, so rates, I mean the prevalence of a disease within a community, 45% of people get this and that, yada, yada, yada. And etiology is going to be the study of the causes. So what led to this disorder. So you're going to see those come up on the quiz a lot. Make sure you understand what etiology is. Make sure you understand what epidemiology is. Make sure you understand what all these different phrases that I talk about. When I talk about morbidity and comorbidity, make sure you understand that. When I talk about risk factors, maintenance factors, protective factors, make sure you understand the differences. So of course, we're going to go into detail this later in the semester. I'm kind of giving you a little bit of a preview. So if you see words like this that are in orange, maybe write them down, maybe highlight them, maybe understand what they mean. Don't just memorize them, understand what it is. So you can explain it to me. Because in office hours, if we're going over a quiz or something and you got something wrong, I might be like, well, tell me what etiology is. Everybody's, oh, I don't know. Well, that's why you got the question wrong. So think about how you can memorize this the best based on your abilities.
All right, so there's going to be different viewpoints when it comes to psychopathology, which we'll talk about today, and it's also covered in our readings. So we have problems in living, which is covered by Zaz. So problems in living is more like, people don't really have psychological issues, they just have problems interfacing with society. Then we have harmful dysfunction, which, talks about how, these mental illnesses cause dysfunction, and that harm is what lets you know there's some kind of a mental illness thing going on. And then we have the 4 Ds of abnormality, and then we have the medical model, and we'll get into detail in a few slides. So with problems in living, we have the reading that y'all should probably do. If you haven't done it yet, go ahead and pause the video, do the reading, come back. So mental illness is just a convenient label for behavior that either society or the individual.
I do want to touch on the readings real quick since I brought up that point about doing the readings. So if you look at our syllabus, which by the way, I know this might be confusing, but the syllabus is correct. This will make sense as I talk about this. There are times in the semester when we are reading ahead. So for example, one week we could be talking about like intro material, but the reading is about mood disorders, and mood disorders is a couple weeks down the road. So what you're doing there, you're doing the course reading ahead of time. You'll also notice there's some weeks when we don't have readings, like you have a little bit of a break. And that's because there's things due, like the assignment or something like that. There's no spring break this semester, so you don't have a break for that, but there are some reading breaks in there when the assignments are due. So you want to look on the syllabus and see when these things are due. Also, there's going to be a calendar that has the due dates. So sometimes you might be watching a lecture about anxiety, but doing readings about psychosis or OCD, and it might be confusing to you, but that's fine. That's fine. You'll notice that every topic in the course has readings associated with it, but sometimes you're reading ahead of time. Now, sometimes the topic we're talking about that week is the topic of the readings, and that's fine. But you'll never see something where we're behind. So, we talked about depression last week, but then next week we have the readings for depression. It's not going to happen that way. You're either doing the readings ahead of time or you're doing the readings the week that we're talking about it in class. Now, keep in mind, since there's no lectures, everything's pre-recorded, you can do this all on Monday. So these videos go live. You can watch them all on Monday, do all the readings. Actually, you know what? I think all the videos are live right now. You can watch every single video. Not this format, but the old format from last semester, and all the readings are live. So you can do it all right now. But you're going to have enough time to do all the readings, and then just check Compass to see when the quizzes go live. Check the syllabus to see when everything's due. If you have any questions, send me an email. But don't send me the question which is like, hey, Walter, I noticed that today the video was about depression, but the readings were about autism. What's going on, Walter? Is the syllabus correct? The syllabus is correct. The syllabus is correct. The syllabus is always correct. The syllabus is always correct. Let's say it with me. Say it with me now. Say, the syllabus is always correct. It's always correct. It's always correct. All right? And besides the syllabus, I should say apart from the syllabus, Compass, the calendar and Compass is always correct. All right? Okay.
Individual in question finds unwanted or unpleasant, and it's a social construct that does not exist in nature. So abnormal behavior is a social phenomenon and might be a perfectly normal response to an abnormal environment, and it's important to consider the situational context. And one of the other things that Thomas Oz said, where he felt that when you say mental illness, this is a value judgment. So you can use mental illness as a label to stigmatize behavior that society has deemed deviant or dangerous. So, one person does the same exact behavior as another, but because this person's from some marginalized group, now we want to give some label on them to try to, discredit them through mental illness. And this is from the 60s, of course.
And just to expand on this, this is also present in our current society. So, for example, let's look at things like, so there's this great documentary on Netflix talking about crack, right? So we talk about the public response to crack cocaine breaking out in the black community in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? Talk about that crack epidemic and how that was treated like a criminal justice issue, and how individuals with with addictions to crack received higher sentences than individuals who were found with cocaine, even if the individuals with cocaine had larger amounts. So you could spend 5 years in prison for 5 grams of crack. But you wouldn't spend 5 years in prison with 5 grams of cocaine. You'd have to be caught with 500 grams of cocaine. Now, juxtapose that against today, where we have the opioid crisis, the opioid addiction epidemic, which is being treated like a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue. And we still have people, which is how it should be treated, as a public health issue. And the same thing is about crack cocaine. And even crack, and not crack cocaine, but even like cocaine, and even like weed, and even like alcoholism, these all should be treated as public health issues, not criminal justice issues. But even to this day, there's still people who are in jail for crack offenses from the 90s and the 80s, when those should be treated as, so that's one way that we can stigmatize mental health. Not just stigmatize the issues, but also stigmatize the people, and then make judgments about them and say, well, these individuals who use this substance, these are like criminal, dangerous people. Whereas these individuals who use this substance, these are just normal working folk who need some help. You see, there's a way that happens. All right, let's keep going.
So now let's talk more about, what Zaz felt this said. He felt that this was more saying that individuals with mental illness don't actually suffer from mental illness. They're actually suffering from problems in living. So problems interfacing with society. All right, so let me go ahead and put this up here for you. So some key points according to Zaz. We have that mental illness is a cultural norm. The assessment of symptoms are based on social norms and require value judgment. Brain disease is a neurological defect. An assessment of symptoms can be directly observed and are less, let me move this out the way for you, and are less open to interpretation.
All right, so in the last video, I kind of talked a little bit about how when you do the readings, you usually try to break down the main points of what's in the article. And this is kind of an example of that. Of course, this isn't sufficient. I wouldn't do just this for the readings. But this is a way that you want to do. You want to kind of like break down the main argument, the main points. What is the author talking about? What are they trying to communicate to you? This is what I would suggest for you to do. This right here should be a little more detailed, or maybe it could be less detailed. Who knows? I don't know like how you best remember things. But this is the way you should do that. Also, as we progress through the semester, I will not be breaking down all the readings for you. I'm going to assume that you know how to do it for yourself. So if you ever need any help with the readings, just come to office hours or send me an email and we'll talk more about it. But this is a good example of how you would make your notes or break down the main points of the reading.
So Zaz felt that, brain disease is a real thing. Brain disease exists. You can measure it. You can observe it. It's like cancer. It's like any other kind of biological disease that people might suffer if you're thinking about the medical model. But when it comes to mental illness, this is just based off like society's agreed upon code of behavior and actions. And, people, might be, just fine mentally, but because society doesn't approve of their behavior, they're being labeled as deviants and they need to be dealt with. So now we're going to move on to talking about harmful dysfunction. This is from Jerome Wakefield. So with harmful dysfunction, a mental disorder is only a disorder, or a condition is only a mental disorder, if it results from failure of some kind of internal mechanism to perform its natural function. And so this failure of this internal mechanism will cause harm to the person as judged by the standards of that person's culture. So we're thinking about think about internal mechanisms, right? This is a little bit harder to do in this format because I'm not getting ideas from the class, but think about it. Think about a failure of an internal mechanism, right? Some mechanism that controls some kind of natural function. And think about how harm to that could, lead to dysfunction. So let's think about anger management, right? You have like this system that regulates your emotions, and you're able to say, oh, I'm feeling angry, I'm going to calm down. But some people, that's broken, and then they get very angry and aggressive, and they don't have that mechanism to control their behaviors is broken. And based on our society, being hyper aggressive is not a good thing, and therefore this person has a mental disorder. So going further, right here we have two conceptualizations of harmful and not harmful. So when does a certain behavior become harmful, right? Is this something that we can look at as a spectrum, or is it a binary? So Jerome Wakefield actually recognizes that not every type of dysfunction can lead to a disorder. So sometimes you have a dysfunction, but it's not a disorder. So what you want to try to do is figure out how you can determine this. So we kind of think about this as, should harm be viewed as let me jump over here real quick. Should harm be viewed as dichotomous, where it's not harmful or harmful, and you have this little line right here which tells you, where that break is? Or is it kind of right here where it's this weird area and it's like the frog in the pot, and this behavior is not really harmful, but then along the line somewhere, it becomes harmful, something like that.
All right. Some people aren't familiar with what frog in the pot is. So, of course, a frog in a pot is you put a frog in cool or warm water or whatever, just natural water, and then you put the heat on low, and then you slowly turn the heat up, and then eventually the frog doesn't notice the subtle change in temperature, and they end up being boiled in the water. And so this is a way to conceptualize some of these spectrums when things are normal and then slowly degrade to the point where you don't even notice that it's gotten extreme. And this happens not just with mental health issues. This is also going to happen in relationships. It can happen in societies. It can happen in a lot of different places where, we didn't think it's this bad, but then all of a sudden, if I were to take a snapshot here and a snapshot here, I would see, wow, this is really like I didn't even recognize how bad things had gotten because I wasn't paying attention, because it happened over a long period of time. And this can happen with, different kinds of mental health issues where, at what point in time does the progression of this illness kind of set off an alarm that something's going on here?
And what do you think about that? Did you do the reading? What did Jerome Wakefield say about that? There we go. So now let's move into the 4 Ds of abnormality. So right here, let me go and just slap these up for you. I'm just going to slap these up. Animations, we don't need animations. What is this? This isn't a sing-along. All right, so let me move my little face over here. There we go. All right, so dysfunction is one of the Ds of abnormality. And so this dysfunction is going to be an interference with your day-to-day life, with your day-to-day operation. So what does that mean? So this dysfunction has to do with you being able to get up in the morning, you being able to hold down a job, you being able to maintain relationships, you being able to support yourself, take care of yourself, to be autonomous, to be independent. This is so if you have a dysfunction, this dysfunction is going to impede or impair your ability to just function as a person. And then you have distress, and this is going to be like the emotional or physical pain. So we think about different kinds of mental disorders, psychopathology. When it comes to distress, is this distressing to the person? Is it distressing to others? What kind of distress is being caused by this individual psychopathology? And then we have deviance. So deviance, this is going to be judgments of abnormal behavior based on society, right? So what are the societal norms around circumscribed behavior? Like what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And then when we have deviance, what's going on here is that whatever you're doing is not appropriate based on society standards. So if I were to wear like a big heavy snow parka and go outside in the middle of the summer, it was 100 degrees and 99% humidity, some people might say that is deviant behavior. Other people might say that certain other kinds of behaviors might be deviant as well. Or even like social norms, oversharing, too much information, that could be considered deviance. Now, dangerousness. So this is going to be behaviors and feelings that are of potential harm. So this could be something where you're thinking about self-harm, you're thinking about, suicide, stuff like that. And there's also thinking about things like, excessive risk-taking, like sharing needles or unprotected sex or like walking along the edge of a building on the rooftops, doing dangerous behaviors that might cause harm to you or others. So it's important to understand, the point at which these of abnormality become clinically significant. So there's a difference between like clinical significance and statistical significance. So with clinical significance, this is a difference where it's become obvious to others and the individual themselves that these are now problematic behaviors. Whereas statistically significant, you do some calculations, you can find a statistically significant result from a study or a treatment, but it's not noticeable to the client or those around them. All right, so a little bit of a difference. That's a layman's definition for clinical significance. And
this comes up a lot in class where people don't understand the differences between statistical significance and clinical significance. I would encourage you to do your research, do your due diligence on the differences. So statistically significant, you could have some change that's detected mathematically using statistics that the individual themselves can't notice. But based on the kinds of analyses that you're doing, you found that there's like a statistically significant effect. But the individual doesn't really notice this. So that's statistical significance. This is what the difference between like statistical significance and clinical significance, where the individual understands, the individual notices, the individual knows that there is an improvement there, and they see there's a difference. They feel that there's a difference, and so there's going to be a lot of issues when it comes to treatments, because sometimes individuals will show clinically significant results. And then you're like, well, this is great because the individual notices this. It's clinically proven. And then, of course, never use that term proven. You don't prove anything but math. All you do is provide evidence in support of a hypothesis, in support of or against a hypothesis. So pretty much right here, people will, say, hey, look, they feel better. This is great. But, they're given a placebo. So this is where you get like the placebo effect from. I don't want to go in this whole big thing. But I would encourage you to look up the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. And if the explanation that I just gave is deficient compared to what you found online, then congratulations. You've just achieved self-education in college, which is what you should be pursuing anyways, because when you go to graduate school, you got to teach yourself anyways. All right. I'm taking a class this semester where I pick out my own readings, and then I write a paper, and then somebody looks at it and says, oh, that's good or that's bad. And so I don't even get any instruction. I have to teach it myself. They just check to see if I taught myself well enough. All right.
Statistical significance. Now, right over here, we have these two separations, right? So on one side, so let me just jump over here. There we go. So these are behaviors, right? These are my like this is normal, right? This is not a dysfunctional behavior. It's not ideal. It's not perfect. It's not really dysfunctional. So there's some distress. You see what I'm talking about? Maybe like there's some, deviance. There's some dangerousness, but honestly, no one is purely functional, purely undistressed, purely, not undeviant, but you see what I'm saying. No one is all over here on this side. We're all somewhere along the spectrum on each of these. We're somewhere along here, right? But then there's an area over here on this side where now our behavior is abnormal, it's dysfunctional, it's distressing, it's deviant, it's dangerous. So like, where does this come from? Like, how do we tell the difference? So like, where's the line? There's no sharp line. There's nothing really separating there. That separation, really, if you think about it, is a socially constructed division. That's like society has decided once you cross this line, you're now abnormal, dysfunctional, distressing, deviant, dangerous. You can operate all the way up to the line, and no one really would pay too much attention to you. So now let's talk more about the DSM-5 definition of mental disorders. Okay, DSM-5 is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. If you've watched my videos, you've already accessed the link to the online DSM-5, which I would encourage you to do often. Okay, so through the DSM-5,
and so on our Compass page in our readings folder, we have a link there to the online DSM-5. And this online access is provided through your Illinois.edu library account. So if you don't have an Illinois library account, you should contact the library and get it set up as soon as possible, because someone's paying for it. You might as well use it. So you can access the online DSM-5 and you can Control F everything and figure out whatever you're thinking about when it comes to disorder. Later in the semester, I will just tell you to go to the DSM-5 and read symptoms and read differential diagnoses and things like that. This is going to be important. You're going to have to read. This is why we don't have a textbook in the class, because we have the online DSM-5, which is like a textbook, and it's free for you because it's at no additional cost. So all you have to do is access the online DSM-5, and then you can read to your heart's content. And for some of you who say, Walter, that's too hard for me, guess what I did? I made a PDF copy of every chapter of the DSM-5 that we cover in this class, and I put it on the Compass page. So you literally have no excuses. You either do the reading, the PDF readings for the DSM-5 that I put on Compass, or you access the online DSM-5. So it's up to you. So there's never an excuse for you not being able to read the DSM-5. If we're taking, trust me, halfway through the semester, we get about quiz 2 or 3, you're gonna want to meet with me, go over your quiz, we're gonna go over it, and I'm gonna ask you, did you read the online DSM-5? And you're going to say no. And you're going to say no. And I'm gonna tell you to read the online DSM-5. So rather than waiting until February or March to read the online DSM-5, just go ahead and make it a habit that you read the online DSM-5. And plus, the online DSM-5, if you're really interested in becoming a clinician or a researcher, you should start doing this now. All right.
The definition of mental disorder is going to be a behavior or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual. This is going to reflect an underlying psychobiological dysfunction, the consequences of which are clinically significant distress or disability. So that distress is going to be the painful symptom that we talked about. Remember, this is clinically significant. So that means that people are noticing. It's easy to notice. I don't need to run analyses to notice this, or I should say statistical analyses. Now we have disability being defined as an impairment or one of more important areas of functioning. Now this must not be merely an expected response to common stressors or losses. So like a loss of a loved one. So, it's normal to feel sad. That's an expected response. If like your mother or your father passes away or a close relative passes away, it's understandable to be sad, but it's not really understandable or an expected response to like lock yourself in your room for weeks at a time and not eat and all sorts of other things. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but whatever kind of response that you have is going to be outside the norm or the expected response. And then also, this is not going to be a culturally sanctioned response. So this might involve things like trance states and different religious rituals, speaking in tongues, things like that, if it's consistent with your religious or cultural beliefs. This also must not be primarily a result of social deviance or conflicts with society. So as is apparent, some behaviors are seen as threatening and dangerous and are requiring some kind of forceful response, whereas the same behaviors by a different group of people are seen as acceptable and, encouraged and valid. So this happens, and there was a point in time when people would try to use mental disorder as a reason for locking people up by saying, look at this person's behavior, I don't want them to do this, so they should be arrested and locked up. Even though that still happens nowadays, but, outside the purview of the course. Well, not really, but we'll get into it a little bit later. Outside the purview of this lesson. All right, so now let's talk more about the medical model according to DSM-5. So these are going to be some good key points here. Take some notes. All right. So when we're looking at the definitions for psychopathology, we're looking at the DSM-5, we want to make each definition for the disorders that we'll cover involves a discussion of distress. It's going to involve a discussion of impaired functioning or some kind of disability associated with a mental disorder. It's going to involve some kind of discussion about risk. These risks have to do with suffering, death, pain, disability, or other kinds of important losses of freedom. These are discussed at length in some of these definitions when we're talking about looking at disorders in DSM-5. Now, when we see these disorders in DSM-5, what we're not going to see are conversations or symptoms containing culturally sanctioned responses to events. Deviant behavior is deemed by society. So this is the conflicts between an individual or society. So when you're looking at the DSM-5, I would encourage you to go to the online DSM-5, look through some of these disorders, pick out your favorite disorder, the one you're most interested in, and you will see conversations or discussions of distress, disability, impairment, and then other kinds of risks. Now, a long time ago, the DSM-5 looked a lot different. There's some disorders that were in the DSM-5 in the past that are no longer in the DSM-5 now. So that's important. So think about that. So let's review these terms. So we talked about these before. Let's review them again. Okay? This is almost like me giving you a little bit of a, those vocab quizzes you used to get in 5th grade. All right, so here's the term, symptoms. All right, you took some notes on this. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Pause the video. What do you think the definition, or what do you remember the definition of symptoms? That's right. The definition is thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that indicate a mental disorder. So what's the definition of syndrome? Go ahead and pause the video. Tell me what you think. Actually, you can't even tell me. This isn't live. Tell yourself what you think. All right, quiz yourself. All right, there we go. It's a group of signs and symptoms that tend to co-occur and are assumed to have a common etiology or course. Now, there are some additional considerations when we're thinking about symptoms. So what are those additional considerations, right? So it's not just the symptoms, but there's a few things associated with the symptoms that we're interested in as well. Do you remember these? Okay, it's not like they're going to be on the quiz or anything. All right. Take some time, pause, think about it. That's right. We got duration, how long the symptoms are lasting for. We have the level of impairment of the symptoms. And then we have the situation or context in which the symptoms occur. Very good. So let's talk a little bit about culture. So Culture is going to be the values, beliefs, and practices of a group of people. So this group of people shares this set of values, beliefs, and practices. So all definitions of psychopathology and problems in living are going to be culturally embedded. So what does that mean? That means that the way that we define like what's abnormal is based on the culture that we live in. Because culture has a profound influence on what we consider normal or abnormal, depending on the time period, depending on different political orientations or whatever. So it's not the same across time. It might change. So when we're talking about Wakefield, from Wakefield's perspective, only dysfunctions that are socially disvalued are seen as disorders. So think about that. What does that mean to you? Socially disvalued. There we go. Think about some examples. Think about nowadays. If I see somebody with like big disc earrings and bunch of piercings and like hair all over the place, I'm not really thinking about it. But if it was like 50 years ago, someone might be like, yo, what's going on with this person right here? What's going on with that? You see what I'm talking about? Because at that time, it was socially disvalued. Someone might think that was some kind of disorder. Nowadays, it's totally normal. People express themselves in different ways. You wouldn't say somebody had a mental disorder based solely on that.
We can also think about our current situation with like the COVID-19 pandemic and how a lot of people are socially isolated. So we're spending time at home. We're not going to work. We're not really leaving the house that much. We might be social distancing, not seeing people that we usually see. And this might be something where outside of a pandemic, this kind of behavior would be would be problematic. You might think about like agoraphobia or something like that. But now, since this kind of behavior is nested within this cultural time, or this time in our culture, or this cultural event that we're all going through, COVID-19, staying at home, social isolating, wearing masks everywhere, using hand sanitizer, which is funny because I remember when the movie, the live action adaptation of The Cat in the Hat, one of the bad guy of the film, he was like such a mean person because he carried around hand sanitizer wherever he went. And he was always like sanitizing his hands. He would shake somebody's hand and then sanitize it. And listen, I do that all the time. I have 5 bottles of hand sanitizer within reach. You know what I'm talking about? I gotta stay focused. But like, I have hand sanitizer everywhere. I'm always sanitizing my hands. I sanitize my hands when I open the door, sanitize my hand when I'm in the car with my friends, sanitize my hand here and there, blah, 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 blah. I'm always hand sanitizing. I'm wearing a mask everywhere. I always wear a mask. I wear 2 masks sometimes if I'm, when I was on the airplane, had an N95 in my fabric mask, I was double dosing, So like, this is a wild time in the history of our society. So some of the things that were once frowned upon, wearing masks everywhere. Imagine 10 months ago. I can't even say 10 months ago. Yeah, a year ago, walking into a bank with a face mask on. Imagine that. Imagine wearing a face mask and walking into a bank. One of those little net gaiters, those little things like people wear them around their neck and then they put them up, right? People wear this face mask, right? People walk into banks like that looking like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. No one says anything because it's happening within this time. So when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about behaviors, we're talking about these kinds of observable traits and symptoms. They change over time. They change over time. All right, let's keep going.
All right, so zeitgeist is spirit of the times. You might have seen a bunch of those videos on YouTube. That's fine. That was a long time ago. But pretty much what this means is that over time, things change. Like I was saying before, the way our culture is today, we don't view things the same way we did before. That includes the DSM-5. So up until the DSM-3, I believe, homosexuality was listed as a psychiatric disorder, a mental illness. And that was in the DSM-5. So you could be diagnosed with being gay. We don't do that anymore. That is out. We're not talking about that. We're not,
So that wasn't in the DSM-5. That was in the DSM-3. Sorry, I said like DSM-5 like 18 times in a row, and I just kept saying it. So the DSM-3, which came out in 1980, up until then, like homosexuality was a psychiatric disorder. So you could be diagnosed with being gay. Yeah, so not that long ago. I was born in 1983, so oh geez, I'm so old. Okay, let's keep watching.
we're not, diagnosing someone with homosexuality. So that's out. That's not happening anymore. Hysteria is out. We don't diagnose people with hysteria. I have a long thing about hysteria. I'm not really the person to comment on hysteria, but I will say this: hysteria is a sexist, misogynistic disorder, a way of expressing opinionated and quote unquote unruly women. So this is a heavily gendered, heavily stereotyped, heavily oppressive term that people would use back in the day. Even nowadays, we still say these terms: mass hysteria, hysterical, stuff like that. And it doesn't really have the same connotation that it used to, but maybe you think about it. There's a lot of terms that we use, and we don't really understand the roots of them. I just learned what guys meant. Do you know what I mean? From like way back in the day, like where the term guys came from. So that's interesting. So if you're interested in learning more about hysteria, be careful with the Google machine, but you can probably find some things. Sure, send me an email coming off his hours.
Also, don't use Bing. Make sure you stick to Google. Don't use Bing.
We'll talk about it. All right, pathological gambling. Boom! We've added that in, right? So a lot of addictions. People start to look at addictions as being more serious now. It's not just like, oh, you have poor willpower, you just can't control yourself, you need better like skills or whatever. It's like, or more discipline. It's like, oh no, you have a gambling addiction. A video game addiction is in, according to the World Health Organization. So now, give me a second. You can be diagnosed with video game addiction, playing games too much. This is different from playing games. Like I said, like alcohol use disorder is different from drinking beer. So when it becomes, what's the duration of these episodes? What's the consequences? What kind of dysfunction is occurring? You see what I'm talking about? Those kind of things that we're thinking about. All right. Now remember, culture is not static. It will continue to change, and it will continue to influence the prevalence of disorders, depending on the time. So honestly, here's the thing. All right, so quick little aside. Every semester, we talk about things, and there's somebody who read something somewhere and feels like whatever disorder we're talking about is terrible and how we shouldn't talk about it anymore. And that's probably right. To some extent, right? But, we're making changes to the DSM-5. Things are going out, things are coming in, things are being expanded. So there's room for all that. But just think about this. Think about how the DSM-5 is going to look to people 50 years from now. You see what I'm talking about? Like, move ahead a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? Like, put yourself in the future a little bit. Think about some of the things that we talk about and how that's going to be viewed down the road, right? We don't know what kind of changes are going to come. We don't know what kind of understanding we're going to gain. So, even though, like, right now, we think we know a lot, maybe we really don't. So, I'm going to teach the DSM-5. That's what we're using, right? But just because I'm teaching the DSM-5 doesn't mean that whatever I'm saying is always going to hold true, or even what I'm saying is the truth. I'm speaking things from my perspective, but also I'm speaking things from the DSM-5 perspective, okay? But we are going to talk about things that are in the DSM-5. We're not going to talk about other things that aren't in the DSM-5 for much, for a lot of time. Maybe we'll bring up a little bit, but usually, I think in this format, since we're all virtual, no one's going to bring up anything too out of left field, but we'll see what happens in office hours. And then disorders are going to be differentially influenced by culture, which means that in certain cultures, people might be assigned or diagnosed with this disorder at differential rates by either within their culture or by people from another culture. and we'll talk about this a little bit more. Okay, so let's talk about different perspectives. We have ETIC and EMIC. So ETIC is going to be the outsider perspective. And then we have EMIC, which is, I jumped ahead. All right. So we have ETIC, which is going to be the outsider perspective, and EMIC, which is the insider perspective. So with ETIC, with outsider perspective, this places an emphasis on universals across human beings, but this is a universal that has been established by someone outside the culture of interest. So this is when somebody observing another culture, think about like Western scientists looking at other cultures, and they're putting an emphasis on what they believe is important. All right? So think about this. Who decides what is abnormal? Let's think about historically. Like I just said, it's going to be Western scientists. It's going to be white guys, older white guys. They're deciding, what's a disorder and what's not. So Western social sciences really started imposing their standards of morality on other cultures. Of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Who's civilized and who's not. Now, especially nowadays, we're really trying to consider the biases that exist within science, and especially within psychology. Even like things like schizophrenia, where black males are diagnosed way too easily with schizophrenia. Black males can't get nothing, but you can get schizophrenia real quick. You know what I'm talking about? So it's like, so now we're starting to acknowledge things like this. So we're starting to acknowledge what kind of behaviors are normal and what should be acceptable, and should a white man's perspective, or should the white person be the default? There's there's a lot of stuff about that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But, even the rat was white. You know what I'm talking about? All right, cool. So, now we have the insider perspective, EMIC, the one I tried to jump to a little bit earlier. So, this is going to be the customs, beliefs, and thinking of group members. And this is going to be prioritized over impressions from observers. And so this is going to examine behavior from within a culture using culture-specific criteria. Now, let's think about it for a second. Are there any drawbacks to this? First of all, there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. Some answers are more right than others in certain situations, and other answers are more right than others in different situations. So, right over here, from my personal life, I would say that there is a perspective on mental health and mental health disorders from in the black community, more specifically in the black community that I was around growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, where there was a discounting of the importance of mental health and mental health treatments.
And who would have thought that I would have to encounter that distrust of public health again when it came to the COVID vaccine? I'm not going to get into all that kind of stuff because for some reason, a public health issue became a political issue. Isn't that so great? Human beings, we're so awesome. But this is not to negate the decades and centuries of medical malpractice and malfeasance that occurred. We're talking about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. We're talking about the immortal cells of Lackawanna. We're talking about all that kind of stuff, right? I don't want to get into I don't want to discount all of that. All that stuff, these are serious concerns, these are serious issues. However, it is now carried over to where a lot of protections were created. So if you've heard of the IRB, right, the Institutional Review Board, a lot of that came out of those terrible experiments from, where people were experimenting on humans who did not consent to be experimented upon. The informed consent. These are things that came from these horrible tragedies that occurred. And so nowadays there are so many protections for participants and for individuals receiving therapy and for individuals receiving vaccines to where, this isn't going to really go bad. And if it does go bad, I mean, things go bad all the time. It's funny thing is we're not like boycotting cars. And people die from cars all the time. It's just it's wild the kind of things that we get mad about. But I understand there are a lot of historical issues that have to do with experimentation and even nowadays there's still issues with racial injustice in the healthcare system. But what I'm trying to do is not to discount those issues, but to try to reinforce that mental health is health, and it is important to take care of your health. And if you find a healthcare provider, especially here on campus, that is not giving you quality health care, then you should tell somebody. There are licensed boards you can talk to. There are numbers you can call. There are things that you can do. I understand that's from a point of privilege because I have health insurance, because I have access to great health care. Maybe you don't have that in your situation wherever you are, and maybe you come from a financial background where there's a lot of struggle, and I understand it, and that's a whole nother conversation to have at a whole nother time. But I do want to I do want to let you know that if you feel that mental health, which is funny if you choose this class to take, but you'd be surprised the kind of people take these classes and get mad about everything. But if you feel like mental health is not a real thing, that it's blown out of proportion, that it's like, that it only affects certain people, we all suffer from mental health issues. We all need help. We all need treatment to various degrees. So please, mental health is real. Take it seriously. Science is pretty good nowadays. I understand all the bad stuff that happened. But let's keep it pushing.
I was an alcoholic for many years. People said I wasn't an alcoholic. I didn't have a drinking problem. I just couldn't hold my liquor. It's like the same thing. You know what I'm talking about? Some people in my family have bipolar disorder and they need medication, but they don't take it because they have different views about the government and what the government's trying to do to them by giving them pills. And some people don't even think like mental disorders even exist. So like within a culture, based on that criteria, you're not going to get a lot of help if you have a mental health issue. So that could be a drawback there. One thing is like it can protect you from the ETIC perspective, where someone comes in and says, all y'all are sick, blah, 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 get you all Tuskegee around here, something like, hey, you don't want to do all that, right? But at the same time, it kind of blocks you off from outside perspectives, which might help you. We don't know everything.
When I refer to Tuskegee, I'm referring to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, like I talked about earlier. Some people don't know the difference between the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and the Tuskegee Airmen, which is funny to me. Actually, it's not funny. It's kind of tragic. It just shows you how our educational system has failed us as a nation. But this is not the course to talk about that or anything else that might have happened in the last, 15 days from the recording of this video. But anyways, let's keep watching.
Within our own particular groups, it's better when people share, but also it's better when, you try to find somewhere in the middle to figure out how to help people rather than imposing wills on other people. All right. So let's talk about epidemiology. Who knows what epidemiology means? So I'm pretty sure now that you're online, you're probably looking at the Google machine. So you probably already know. So epidemiology is going to be...
Remember, kids, use Google, not Bing. This is not sponsored by Google, but type anything into Bing and see what comes up.
The study of the frequency and distribution of disorders within a population. So this is going to be how often does psychopathology occur. So I really hate big words like this. I really can't understand or memorize all these big words. So it helps me when things get broken up. So this is a great way to break up epidemiology. So epi means upon. So epidemic, right? You see what I'm talking about? All right. Demi means people, right? All right. People. Ology means study. Psychology. geology. All right? So upon people study. So you study what befalls a people. All right? So comorbidity, this is going to be the manifestation of one or more disorder at the same time. Here's how to remember this. Comorbidity. Co means with, more than one, right? A co-manager, a co-sponsor, right? Someone that you're with, right? More than one. Cooperative. Morbidity means sickness. So literally, comorbidity roughly translates to more than one sickness. More sicknesses. With sicknesses. Two or more sicknesses. You see what I'm saying? Okay, comorbidity. So, now let's throw some of these words together. Some of these words that we learned. What does it mean when someone says there is heterogeneity in the comorbidity of psychological disorders? Ooh. See, listen. Remember how I was talking about before? I really want to prepare you to teach yourself, yada, yada, yada. This is what I'm talking about right here. You'll see stuff like this all the time, and people will just expect you to read this and know what it means. Now, some of you know what this means, but trust me, some of you are seeing this sentence, and you're like, this doesn't make no dang sense. What are you talking about, man? You see what I'm saying? Okay, so this pretty much means that across psychological disorders, comorbidity is different. That's pretty much what it means, right? So comorbidity is not the same across psychological disorders. So certain psychological disorders are going to have different comorbidity than others. Super simple, but this is the kind of stuff you want to write in papers because then people think you're really smart. All right, let's talk about epidemiology, some more helpful terms. Let's talk about incidence. So incidence, this is going to be the number of new cases of a disorder that occur within a certain time period. You want to think about 12 months, 6 months, stuff like that, right? All right. Now we have prevalence. Prevalence is going to be the total number of active cases, both old and new, present in the population at a given time. Okay? Now let's keep moving. Okay? Lifetime prevalence. This is going to be the total number of people in a given population who have been affected by the disorder at some point in their life. And lifetime morbid rate. This is the total number of people in a given population who will be affected by the disorder at some point in their lives, even when they have not started to show symptoms yet. So let's say, for example, if I'm saying right here, it's 2020, right? And we're thinking about lifetime prevalence. So that's everyone, whatever time window I specify, who has a certain disorder up to this point, right? Now, I'm talking about lifetime morbid rate. I'm thinking about people who are going to be affected by the disorder at some point in their lives. So this is like even people who right now in 2020 aren't even showing symptoms, but that person who's alive right now in 2020, who some point in the future might get a disorder, okay? It's a little bit of predictive science there. All right. Now let's look at these iClicker questions, but y'all don't have iClickers. All your quizzes are going to be online, right? So right here, take a look at this. This is a way for us to practice. All right, so we have how many individuals will be counted for the incidence of depression in 2006. So let's talk about how this works. So those of you who have the video off or listening like a podcast, this isn't going to work out for you. You might want to wait till you get home and watch this again. So we have these two lines here, right? These lines mark the beginning of 2006, and this line marks the beginning of 2007, okay? So our timeline, so right here along the x-axis, that's the timeline. We have July 2005 all the way through January 2007 and beyond, okay? And we have 4 people. We have Mark, Kyle, Julie, Jen, and Joe, okay? Now,
We have 5 people. Math is hard. Okay.
many individuals will be counted for the incidence of depression in 2006? Oh, excuse me. The incidence of depression in 2006. What does incidence mean? What did we just talk about? What does that mean? Think about it. Pause the video. Go ahead and pause. All right. Now come back. Okay. What do you think the answer is? Is it A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, D, 4, or E, 5? Which one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The right answer is B, 2. Incidents. Wasn't that new cases? So you see right here, I have Julie and Jen. Those are the only 2 new cases in 2006. See how that works? Now there's 3 lines right here, right? But this person already had it. So only Julie and Jen just got it. See how that works? All right, now you're getting it. So how many individuals will be counted for the incidence of depression in 2007? We just did this. Look at the chart. Where's 2007? All right, you got it. All right. Now, incidence. How many people have depression in 2007? Okay. So, looking at the people who have depression in 2007, which one would be counted for the incidence? How many? How many do you have? The answer is 1. 1. So as you see right here, I have 3 people with depression in 2007. But only 1 incidence of depression in 2007. 1 new case in 2007. All right. All right, let's do this one here. All righty. So how many individuals will be counted for the 12-month prevalence of depression in 2006? 12-month prevalence. What does that mean? 12-month prevalence in 2006. What 12 months is that referring to? Okay. You thinking about it? All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Which one is it? Do you know? Well, I know. What, do you know? Okay. Boom. There we go. It's going to be 3. So 12-month prevalence, that is how many people have depression in this 12-month window. And this 12-month window is from January 2006 to the end of 2006, right? Where it cuts off in January 2007. So that second red line cuts it off. So you have 3 people who have depression at 12-month prevalence in 2006. All right. Here's another one for us. How many individuals will be counted for the lifetime prevalence of depression in 2006? Lifetime prevalence. So what does lifetime prevalence mean? Remember we talked about lifetime prevalence and lifetime morbidity. Remember we talked about that? And there's a difference between the two. So we are in 2006. We are looking at the lifetime prevalence. Anybody remember what that means? Okay. So we have A, B, C, D, E. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how many people? All right. You already know. So there we go. It's 4. Kyle, Julie, Jen, and Joe. So even though in 2006, Joe doesn't have a depression, we're talking about lifetime prevalence. So at any point in time before 2006, at some point in time, Joe had depression. So he counts for the lifetime prevalence in 2006. All right. So now we're going to move ahead and talk about adult epidemiology.
All right. So if any of that did not make sense to you, if any of that was confusing, if you don't understand what's going on, I would encourage you to come to office hours to send me an email or to look up those terms and, just get a better sense of it. We will talk about epidemiology, a whole lot in this course. So if you don't understand what's happening, go ahead and reach out to me. I will not reach out to you because I don't know where you are. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what's happening. You're going to have to reach out to me. You really are. You really are going to reach out to me. I'm willing to help you, but we're going to have to talk. All right, let's keep going.
All right. So we're going to talk about lifetime morbid rate by disorder, and this is based off Kessler et al. And you can go to search.proquest.com and look up that article. Or you can send me an email. I'll help you out. So anxiety disorder is about 41.7%. Mood disorder.
So search.proquest.com, that is the database service that the library account will give you access to. So if you haven't registered your UIUC library account, you need to go ahead and do that. That's going to help you out. You're going to see a lot of these citations and things showing up during lectures. You'll see a lot of citations showing up in the DSM-5. You can actually read those research articles in their entirety at no additional cost on search.proquest.com. This is what graduate students use in order to identify articles. It's also what a lot of professors use. And if you're interested in becoming like a research assistant, or if you're interested in becoming like an honor student, knowing how to use ProQuest, PubMed, other kinds of databases will help you out. In a tight pinch, scholar.google.com works, but just typing in article names into regular Google or Bing, especially Bing, that might get you in trouble.
Is about 30.7%. Lifetime prevalence rate by disorder. Let's go through this right here. We have substance use disorders, 14.6%. Schizophrenia, 1%. Eating disorders, 1%. And in 2017, only 42.6% of adults with a mental health diagnosis reported receiving treatment. Okay. So this is something that we all want to talk about a little bit later, but there are some barriers to treatment. There's also some barriers to getting diagnosed. But once you receive a diagnosis, there are barriers to receiving treatment. Some of this can be economic, some of this can be cultural, and some of this can be just how in our society we have this great stigma about mental health where we don't want to talk about it. It's a dirty little secret. It's impolite conversation, yada, 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 stuff like that. Now, one thing that we will continue to talk about later in the semester, which will help you on pretty much all the quizzes, is understanding that even though you might not have a diagnosis for a particular mental disorder because you don't meet the threshold or the threshold of the symptoms, the diagnostic threshold based on your symptoms, right? Subthreshold symptoms can still cause significant levels of distress and impairment. Okay? So subthreshold symptoms can still cause a significant level of distress and impairment. Okay.
So when we talk about depression, we'll talk about this a little bit more. So I'm throwing a number up there. Let's say you need 5 symptoms to meet diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder, but you only have 4 symptoms. Do you think that somebody's life is so much better because they only have 4 symptoms instead of 5 symptoms? Not really. So you have a sub-threshold number of symptoms and you probably have significant levels of distress and impairment. Heck, even one of the symptoms is pretty distressing and impairing. So it's important to keep in mind that just because someone doesn't meet diagnostic criteria, it doesn't mean that they are perfectly fine. And they still might need help and support. It's just this can be very difficult, especially when we're talking about insurance companies, which make it hard for individuals with sub-threshold levels of distress and impairment to receive reimbursement for some of their services.
All right, so here are some charts. All right, so this is going to be from the NIH. And then we have some different, stats from SAMHSA. Okay. And so what we're talking about people with different disorders across different age groups, right? So what you want to see here is how this changes depending on the age bracket, depending on the race, ethnicity, depending on sex. So we have overall prevalence of any mental illness. Then right here we have among men and women, or males and females I should say. And then we have among these different age groups, as you see, 18 to 25 has the highest. And then we see here across different races and ethnicities. And remember, we were talking about before, we were talking about how there's different barriers to receiving a diagnosis. So some of these differences might indicate that some races or ethnicities have higher rates of or higher prevalence of mental illness. And it also could say that some ethnicities are underdiagnosed. Okay. So now let's talk about the kids. Pediatric epidemiology. Alright, so let me just go ahead and just put this up. Boom, 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 boom. This ain't no sing along. Alright. So in the US, the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in children are ADHD, behavioral disorders, anxiety, and depression. And so we have a 9.4% for between ages of 2 and 17. That's for ADHD. For behavioral disorders, we have a 7.4% incidence between 3 and 17, 7.1% incidence between 3 and 17 for anxiety, 3.2% incidence for depression between ages of 3 and 17. Now it's important to understand that when it comes to pediatric epidemiology, or I should say for psychopathology, you're going to have a high rate of comorbidity. So one child would probably have multiple different kinds of mental health disorders at that time. Now, over time, there has been an increase in the amount of children who have been diagnosed with a particular mental health disorder. So that's good. But also, it's kind of unfortunate because even though you receive a diagnosis, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to receive treatment. And the access to treatment differs across the country depending on where you live. Within a state, within a city, it can be very, very difficult to get treatment. And then not all disorders identified in childhood persist into adulthood. So if you have depression as a child, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be depressed as an adult. Okay. This is not necessarily true for some other disorders, things like ADHD or autism spectrum disorders. But over time, you can learn different kinds of adaptations to, get through life. All right. So here's some more charts for you. Talking about kids. So what do you notice here? When do all these disorders? Look at this. Look at this right here. We have 3 to 5, 6 to 11, 12 to 17. Depression, it's kind of low, but then all of a sudden, boom, big jump. 12 to 17. Anxiety, 6 to 11. It kind of goes up a little bit, but then boom, big jump. Look at this right here. Behavior disorders. Behavior disorders kind of go up and then kind of fall off. What's going on here with this 12 to 17 thing? What's going on? Huh? Who remembers what happens between 12 to 17? That's right. Puberty. So that onset, that rush of hormones and all that kind of stuff, that can lead to a lot of problems. Okay? Right here for behavior disorders, let's just be honest. Kids is rambunctious. So 6 to 11, I wouldn't want to teach that age range.
All right, and also when you're looking at these charts, keep in mind that between the ages of 3 to 5, what are most children doing? They're at home with their parents. When they get around 6 years old, that's when a lot of them enter public schools. And so a lot of diagnoses are made in public schools because the teacher notices some behavior. And then depending on the school, they have a school psychologist, or maybe they refer the parents to go to see somebody. And this is where a lot of diagnoses can actually be identified. This is the same thing that kind of happens with autism spectrum disorders. You see a lot of children being diagnosed in the first couple of years of school. And then also this is kind of where some of the early confounds of vaccines and autism came from, because autism is usually discovered when someone enters school. And what else do you have to do before you start school? Make sure your vaccinations are up to date. Now remember, kids, Correlation is not causation. And we'll talk more about that vaccination study later, why it was bogus, and if you're an anti-vaxxer, you should just stop immediately. Okay, but hey, you can be it for now. You can be anti-vaxxer for now, but then later in the semester, you won't feel so good about it. Maybe you already know what I'm talking about. Little spoiler alert. Okay, good job. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. All right.
Undergrad's hard enough, but man, can you imagine teaching a bunch of 6 to 11-year-olds? Oh, what a nightmare. But, over time, they kind of get better. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about epidemiology in general. We're kind of zooming out again. All right, so the 1-year prevalence of any mental disorder diagnosis is about 20%. So that means within a 1-year time period, about 20% of the population has some kind of mental health diagnosis. Now we're talking about the 1-year prevalence of substance use disorders. So at any point in time, a 1-year prevalence of substance use disorders is going to be about 6%. All right. So let's start here. It's about 9% of the population have mental disorder diagnoses and experience functional impairment. About 5% of the population have severe mental health disorder diagnoses, but only about 0.5% receive disability benefits. All right, so we do have some racial discrepancies in epidemiology. So, for example, incidence and prevalence of psychopathology in the U.S., minorities actually equal or less than white individuals, but minorities report higher burden of disability. Bi or multiracial individuals are more likely to report mental illness than other racial or ethnic minority group. And when you're thinking about this incidence and prevalence, also you want to think about how, in the U.S., even though the minorities might have equal rates of incidence and prevalence, even when they do have a mental disorder, there's going to be differential rates when it comes to treatment. So even though white individuals might make up about 20% or so of the population with a mental disorder, when it comes to the amount of people with mental disorder receiving treatment, white individuals make up 48%. Some populations are also more commonly misdiagnosed because of their racial ethnic identities. So this can be thought of as African Americans being more likely to be misdiagnosed with schizophrenia when compared to white people. And then also minority youth presenting with mental disorders are more likely to be sent to the juvenile justice system, while white youth are more likely to be referred to primary care. So like I said before, some people get thrown in jail, other people get the treatment that they need. And there's also some sex discrepancies in epidemiology, and this really depends on age. So male children are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental disorder than female children. Most sex differences emerge around 11 and a half years. And then trans, non-binary, and genderqueer individuals have a higher risk for psychopathology. All right, so that's going to be it for week number 1. Don't forget to do your reading questions. Don't forget to do your participation points. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, go ahead and give me an email, wjv3@illinois.edu. All right, and I'll see you next week. All right, peace.
All right, so that's going to be the end of this video. What I would suggest for you to do is email me. I give you my email every week because I want you to use it to ask questions about course content. Think about the emails before you send them. Just think about it for a second. Okay. All right, but yeah, if you have a question, you can ask me anytime. Doesn't matter. If you have any problems, let me know. We'll help you out. Let me know what you think about these kind of videos via email. Comment on the YouTube link or comment on the comment and let me know what you're thinking. Like, dislike, it's whatever. I'm going to go ahead and keep doing these. Remember, the original lectures, unedited in their entirety, are available in the same folder. I'll leave these up here in case you like these ones. I kind of see myself using this kind of format to fill in any gaps and to take to replace the in-person discussion that occurred in class. So usually we would have good conversations talking about the examples in the course material and things like that. So I'm going to try to continue to fill those gaps. Maybe later we'll have some quiz review. Not for the intro content. I mean, geez, you should get A's on this quiz. But like for some of the later content, we could do some review. Maybe I could just make a video that is a quiz review. Don't forget to get on the compass and fill out the office hours survey. You should do that as soon as possible. All right, peace. So I'm gonna head out.